Some people do it outside where the weather's always sunny. And some people do it in their homes where the weather doesn't matter. And then there is the Bushmaster, who, for whatever reason, does it out here in the desert. And while it is possible, it's not easy. Just ask the crew that abandoned the effort next door. So keep watching, because the Bushmaster started with a dream and a 6-month budget of $21,000, which might actually be enough to make it happen if he doesn't run into any more problems. And you know we're talking about growing and donating cannabis, right? My oh my, how times have changed. Now, let's see what the Bushmasters do. And I know you've been dying to find out how the last episode turned out when that windstorm blew apart the Bushmaster's tent. And we'll go over the rebuild and everything else you need to know in this episode. But before we do that, we still have our weekly chores to do. So we're going to inspect the little tent. And we're going to inspect the bud damage from the windstorm in the big tent. And we will go over the rebuild for sure, because it turned out medium good. And we'll go over the upgrades that the Bushmaster made to the new tent. But there's still a lot of work to do because the season is about to change and the winter storms are coming. And it's only going to get colder. So the Bushmaster has to decide how he's going to heat everything. And we still have to make time for cloning and transplanting. And even though we're only going to go over the cloning in this video and then the transplanting in the next video, the Bushmaster still has all of his chores to do. So we're going to spend some time watering veg before we take a fun little look, a closer look at the Bushmaster's personal life. Because after all, this is a 24/7 job. So there's really nowhere for the Bushmaster to go. All right, let's start this episode now. So let's start with a walkthrough of the little tent. And these are what the plants look like this week after that windstorm. That's pretty brutal. You can see how they're laying down. And then, when we compare that to last week, you can really see the damage the windstorm did going forward. Look at those tops on Cha-Cha and Jennifer. Now, this is Cha-Cha last week before the storm. Look at those buds. They're standing up. The branches are strong. The plant is really green. That's a good-looking cannabis plant. And this one's Jennifer, right next to Cha-Cha. And she looks great too. Just look at those buds. They're standing up. It's fantastic. That's another good-looking cannabis plant, and that was just before the storm. And then we had the windstorm, and now look at her. She's laying down on the job. The buds are no longer standing up. This is definitely not the same plant she was 2 weeks ago. And it's not just her. Look at Cha-Cha. She's having a problem too, because this is what they look like now, and this is what they look like before the windstorm. Which is why in the last episode I suggested that the Bushmaster is going to lose up to 30% value. And where there was an estimated 92 pounds with possibly 3 pounds of plant. After something like this, the Bushmaster will be lucky at 2 pounds a plant. And that's not the only damage that happens when a plant lays down. When the buds bend over, it gets even worse. And we'll go over that more later. But for now, let's take a look at the damage to the plants inside the big tent. Okay, so let's follow the Bushmaster into the big greenhouse and let's check out the damage, because the Slimers really seemed to take the worst of it. They were the smallest plants and they were up against the edge, and you can really see how the wind pushed the buds down and how they're hanging now instead of standing straight up. And the wind was brutal. And the top stayed up for 2 weeks while the Bushmaster rebuilt and reinforced the tent so he could hang the plastic again without having to do this a third time. And when we look at Azazal Mary and Sir Mix-a-Lot, we can see that these buds have started to stand back up. Now, this is a shot from the next video, so you can see the plants in the big greenhouse have really recovered because the buds are standing up. When we compare them to the buds in the little greenhouse, and you can see how with Jennifer and Cha-Cha, the buds gave up the ghost and they're laying down. And that's important because bad things happen later when your buds lay down. And when we look at next week's video of the big greenhouse, you can see the greenhouse looks better. The buds have recovered and the spaces between the plants have really started to fill in. And that's good because the Bushmaster's still working on that November 21st deadline. And the last thing he wants between now and then is another fiasco. And he doesn't want to have to rebuild the tent a third time because the damage was severe. It blew holes in the tent. It shifted the plants, and it took the Bushmaster literally 2 weeks to rebuild the tent while maintaining the plants before he was able to put the tarp back up. But when he did, you can see how much better and tight this new greenhouse is, because this is the second time he built it. So you should expect him to get better. And the last thing the Bushmaster wants is to end up like the crew next door, whose big move was to dig trenches and put 100 or so gallon cloth pots into them. And you can see the results. So where the crew next door failed and went home and abandoned the project because they made the decision to dig expensive trenches in the super hard ground and try to plant outdoors, literally outdoors, the Bushmaster knew better and invested his time in building a tent. Well, he invested his time twice in building this tent because the wind huffed and puffed and blew the first one down. So now let's take a look at some of the upgrades and the progress the Bushmaster made on his new tent. And this is what the tent looks like now. But we should probably start a few weeks ago before the windstorm, because this was the first greenhouse the Bushmaster ever built. And you can see the mesh doesn't go all the way down to the ground. And it doesn't go all the way from end to end either. And you can see the plants are blowing. And that's because the Bushmaster didn't understand that when you have a round dome on top of your greenhouse instead of a square one, it's an arc. And an arc always takes up a longer length than straight across. And now the Bushmaster lowered the tent too. You can see how many ribs he has in it now. He really has done a much better job. And if you remember the first time he did it, he only put 3 ribs in the middle, 12 feet apart. And soon as it got windy, and soon as he put up that plastic mesh, there wasn't enough ribs. But this time, when the Bushmaster rebuilt it, he definitely put enough ribs. He put 3 times as many because it was blowing really hard. And he figured twice wouldn't be enough, so the ribs are 4 feet apart now. That way, it'll be able to take the windstorms that are coming this winter. And the Bushmaster worked really hard. He had to drive 2 of these in for every rib that he added. And this is how it starts. The ribs go up. And from inside the tent, this is what it looks like. You can see the ribs starting to support the roof. And while the Bushmaster finishes building the roof on the greenhouse, let's go over some accounting practices to keep up on where he's at. Because we started this episode with $6,730. And after paying rent, food and fuel, utilities, buying fans for veg and fans for the upgrade in the big greenhouse here, and tubing, and a second round of newts, his monthly expenses are $3,980, which leaves him with $2,750 and at least 4 weeks to go until he's done flowering. And you got to admit, the Bushmaster did a pretty good job putting that tarp up, right? Because when you look at the finished product, even though there's no door, that's a pretty tight structure. Because this is how it looked after the windstorm. It was too high. There weren't enough ribs. Neither end was anchored. And it's only going to get worse out here as winter approaches. Remember that? Whew. Now, this is the greenhouse that the Bushmaster built in the next storm that rolled through. Look how it held up. That's a couple hours worth of storm. And you got to remember that it's only going to get worse because as the seasons change, it's only going to get colder as the nights get longer, which brings the Bushmaster up to the next problem, temperature. Because as the temperatures get colder, the flow inside the plant slows down. And eventually, if it gets so cold that the plant freezes, the cells will lyse and the plant will die. And that's not the same thing as broken branches from the wind, which is why the Bushmaster was so careful this time to make sure that the cover of the greenhouse goes all the way down to the ground so he can trap the heat from the propane burner in there. Because if you remember what the greenhouse used to look like with the mesh, it was windy and cold, and it's only going to get colder as winter approaches. And since the Bushmaster has already done this once, he's much better at it now, so it was easy for him to take the time to do some upgrades. Now you already know about the additional support ribs and the horizontal bar, and he's going to need that because he's pulling a solid plastic greenhouse cover over it this time that will better seal his garden. And he has to do that because winter is coming and he's going to want to trap the heat in there. And since he's looking to better control the inside environment of his greenhouse, the Bushmaster has also added this fan. Okay, so we're all caught up on the damage done from last time and the rebuild the Bushmaster went through this time along with the upgrades. But before we get into cloning, which is one of the chores the Bushmaster has to do this week, I would like to go over a couple of concerns that I have from watching all this happen in the background. For instance, when the Bushmaster lowered the tent 3 feet, that brought the edges in closer. And we all know what happened when the wood frame from the plant structures touched the tarp last time. It tore right through it with the windstorm. And that looks like it's happening again this time, because you can see the Bushmaster is aware of it, and he's already starting to tape up where the wood touches the plastic, because he knows it's going to tear through. And now that it is covered in greenhouse plastic, you can see the humidity build up. And that's another big problem, because humidity is how plants breathe out. It's a byproduct of the metabolic process that turns light into sugar. And even though the Bushmaster spends an hour or so a day de-leafing the plants, not all the way, just so it exposes the buds a little more, he's also starting to add heat because of the winter. And that means the plants are going to work harder, and there's going to be more humidity in the greenhouse. And because he's venting and trying to control it, he's going to have to juggle both the heat and the humidity. And it's only going to get worse as winter approaches. But that's not the only problem humidity brings. See, when a plant lays down like this, the air can't flow through it like it can when all the buds are standing up. And it's important that the buds be standing up like this and not just for airflow. And we'll get into that in a minute. But for the moment, when a plant is laying down, like all these plants in the little greenhouse, there are problems that occur. And one of those problems is bud rot. Because as the humidity builds up, coupled with the fact that the air is not blowing between the buds, you're going to get bud rot. And bud rot will take over a garden quick. And in as little as 48 hours, this whole garden could be wiped out for no other reason than a lack of airflow. And it actually gets worse. And let's talk about why I keep mentioning that the buds need to be facing up. Because when they lay down, that's a big problem too. See, plants are chemically and genetically configured to be phototropic. They know exactly where the light is throughout the day. And you can see that in time-lapse photography. Plants open and turn toward the light. And they do that through a chemical mediator inside their leaves. When one side of the leaf is getting more light, it creates more of a secondary signal, and the plant turns in that direction. And in that way, it's able to follow the sun throughout the day for maximum efficiency. But when a branch lays down, something happens, because the plant knows it's a top and directs all of her energy into those tops, so you get those big long-armed buds. But when a plant lays down, all the lower buds get the same amount of light as the top. And now, instead of getting one long-armed bud, you get many tops that are smaller, and that's less efficient. And the weight goes down because of it. It also makes trimming more difficult. And so you have to be careful that the plant stands up throughout the whole cycle and that the tops stay the tops. And you might hear people talk about that in low stress training, and that's great if you're an indoor grower. But out here, under the sunlight, where the buds can grow 3 and 4 feet long, it's the exact opposite of what you want. So we'll have to keep an eye on that too. Now, before we get to veg, let's go through what the Bushmaster had to do for cloning this week. And I know soon as I say the word cloning, that your spine tightens, because the biggest problem that comes through my store is probably people complaining that their clones die. And that's because you don't take cuttings from healthy plants. See, the Bushmaster here gets roots in 3 to 7 days because he takes cuttings from healthy plants. And look at this clone. It does not look fantastic. The roots look great, but the clone does not look fantastic. And yet, in 6 weeks, they'll look like this. And the reason they grow so fast and they get so big is because when the Bushmaster takes his cuttings, he dips them in Clonex rooting gel. Yes, they'll root without the gel, but if you want these kinds of explosive root growth and growth rates, you're going to have to start healthy cuttings in Clonex rooting gel. And the same thing holds true. If you're growing indoors, you have to start from a bright, green, healthy growing plant if you want those healthy cuttings. And while we'll go over more about transplanting and how the Bushmaster uses Nutrimix, for the moment, you can see just how good that last round of plants holds together, and those cuttings look the same as this one. And that's because the Bushmaster adds mycorrhizae from Plant Success and Great White when he transplants, because that's what it takes to get those explosive growth rates in veg. And same thing when the Bushmaster makes a tea. Check that out. And he makes his teas the same way he does his transplanting. There's mycorrhizae from Plant Success. And when he takes his clones, he dips them in Clonex rooting gel because he knows he wants those roots to start 2 inches up the stalk and all the way around. And if you remember a couple of episodes ago, the Bushmaster had to spray with azosol for bugs because we found those damaged leaves in the first 2 weeks of flower, and we weren't sure if it was leaf miners or grasshoppers, and we used azosol, and the bugs never came back. And when the Bushmaster watered and fed, he was using Humboldt nutrients. And while I'm not prepared to tell you if the Bushmaster wins or loses yet, I am prepared to tell you, though, that this is a team effort, and it requires a lot of really great products and an average grower. And next week, we're going to go over the complete transplanting video where the Bushmaster tops, lollipops, shapes up, and fims these plants. Of course, we're going to check back in on the clones too, but for now, let's take a look at veg. So the best place for us to start is to follow the Bushmaster into veg and just look at how good veg looks. And the Bushmaster mixes his nutrients just like you mix yours, and pH adjusts it just like you pH yours. And just like you hate those shitty little pumps, the Bushmaster hates them too, especially when you're watering this many plants. That's why in the next episode, we're going to go over the upgrade from this pump to the Mondi Sump Pump 1100 GPH. And while the Bushmaster gets all of the animals out of veg and out of the house so he can start watering, I'm going to go over the schematics of the veg area with you. So let's start with a quick review, and this is where the veg area is going to end up. But if you remember a couple of weeks ago, the Bushmaster started 80 plants under 2,000 watts. So it looked like this. And then about 2 weeks later, the Bushmaster upgraded veg because the plants were looking good. So veg is now 3,000 watts. And then a couple of weeks later, about week 4 into veg, the Bushmaster divided up the plants. Now there's only 60 plants in the large veg room, and they're still under 3 lights. But the other 20 plants, well, they're in the front room now, and they have a 1,000-watt light of their own. And this is what it looks like now. And these are what the plants look like, and they look fantastic. And while we're going to upgrade again in a couple of weeks, and this is what that schematic looks like, for now though, let's take a look at the Bushmaster's personal life. We can see the Bushmaster is not pretentious. He wears work clothes. And when we look more closely at his eating habits, we can see he eats pretty healthy. I like those chocolate ones. And when we look in his fridge, I can tell you I remember the days of living off ketchup and bottled water, but I definitely don't remember having one of these. But then, hey, it's probably important if you're cooking in the kitchen too. Uh-oh. So he's a little messy, but that's not too bad. He's got a toothbrush. That's important. And let's see what he's reading. Very deep. Wait, pump the brakes. What's that? Well, I guess when you eat stuff like this, and maybe it just falls out. Okay, thanks for watching, and thanks to the Bushmaster for another great episode. I'm the Grow Boss, and if you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions between now and then, you can always schedule a consult with me by clicking here. Trust me, I know how much you've spent and how much time you have invested in this, and I promise I can fix your garden in about an hour, so call me before you quit.